For our Group 5 presentation, we had to analyze Shakespeare's publications and an introduction to this text. Our job was to create an outline that the other students would be able to use to learn from about the play and be ready to explain and answer questions from the students after we were to present our topic. Question 1. What are the different versions of the published plays called and how are they different? Here's some quotes we took from the book. These 18 appeared separately in editions and quarto, or in the case of Henry VI, Part 3, octavo format. The quarto pages are not much larger than a modern mass-market paperback book, and the octavo pages are even smaller. These little books were sold unbound for a few pence. In 1623, 7 years after Shakespeare's death, Mr. William Shakespeare's Comedies, Histories, and Tragedies was published. This printing offered readers in a single book 36 of the 38 plays, now thought to have been written by Shakespeare, including 18 that had never been printed before, and it offered them in a style that was then reserved for serious literature and scholarship. The plays were arranged in double columns on pages nearly a foot high. This large page size is called folio, as opposed to the smaller quarto, and the 1623 volume is usually called the Shakespeare First Folio. It is reputed to have sold for the lordly price of £1. Question 2. How do these differences affect our version of the play that we are reading? Here's some quotes we took from the book. More recently, this story has given way to another in which the shorter versions are said to be recreations from memory of Shakespeare's plays by actors who wanted to stage in the provinces but lacked manuscript copies. Most of the quartos offer much better text than these so-called bad quartos. Indeed, in most of the quartos, we find texts that are at least equal to or better than what is printed in the folio. Many Shakespeare enthusiasts persuaded themselves that most of the quartos were set into type directly from Shakespeare's own papers, although there is nothing on which to base this conclusion except the desire for it to be true. Thus, speculation continues about how the Shakespeare plays got to be printed. The present edition is based directly on the 1600 quarto. For the convenience of the reader, we have modernized the punctuation and the spelling of the quarto text. Sometimes we go so far as to modernize certain old forms of words. It is not our practice in editing any of the plays to modernize words that sound distinctly different from the modern forms. We also modernize and, where needed, correct passages in foreign languages, unless an error in the early printed text can be reasonably explained as a joke. Editors and readers have often had trouble distinguishing among three characters with closely similar names, Celerino, Solanio, and Celerio. We correct or regularize a number of the proper names in the dialogue and stage directions, as is the usual practice in editions of the play.
What are some of the reasons for the differences between the different versions? Here are some examples from the book. The Merchant of Venice was first printed in 1600 as a quarto. Then in 1619, someone used a copy of the 1600 quarto as the basis of a second quarto edition of the play. But whoever produced this 1619 quarto does not seem to have had access to either an author's manuscript or the one from the theater, and does not seem always to have understood the play. In 1623, the play was again printed, this time as a part of the collection of Shakespeare's plays, now known as the First Folio. Whenever we change the wording in the first quarto, or we add anything to its stage directions, we mark the change by enclosing it in superior half brackets. We want our readers to be immediately aware when we have intervened. Only when we correct an obvious typographical error in Q1 does the change not get marked. Whenever we change either the wording or punctuation of Q1 so that meaning changes, we list the change in the textual notes at the back of the book, even if all we have done is fix an obvious error. For the convenience of the reader, we have modernized the punctuation and the spelling of the quarto text.
Question 4. How else has Folger's changed the play for us? Here are some quotes from the book. The book collector who was most successful in bringing together copies of quartos in the First Folio was Henry Clay Folger, founder of the Folger Shakespeare Library in Washington, D.C. While it is estimated that there survive around the world only about 230 copies of the First Folio, Mr. Folger was able to acquire more than 75 copies. as well as a large number of fragments, for the library that bears his name. As a consequence of Mr. Folger's labors, scholars visiting the Folger Shakespeare Library have been able to learn a great deal about 16th and 17th century printing, and particularly about the printing of Shakespeare's plays. Mr. Folger did not stop at the first folio, but collected many copies of later editions of Shakespeare, beginning with the second folio, 1632, the third, 1663 to 1664, and the fourth, 1685. Each of these later folios was based on its immediate predecessor and was edited anonymously. The first editor of Shakespeare,